Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
You are a philosopher of science. Could you just tell us briefly, what is philosophy of science?
Yes, well, I like to say I'm a historian and philosopher of science. I mean, I'm trained as a philosopher. That's to say, I'm trained on, the greats, Plato and Aristotle and Descartes and Locke, Berkeley, Hume and all of that. So as a philosopher, I always like to think philosophy is sort of like a second order subject. One does science, let's say biology, or one does politics, or dare I say, one does theology or religion. And then the philosopher comes along and says, now, why are people disagreeing about certain aspects? Why, for instance, to take an example, why is it okay in biology to say the function of the nose is to smell, but if in astronomy you said the function of the moon is, well, what? To light the way home for drunken philosophers. It's a joke. And so a philosopher says, now what's going on here? Why is it that biologists are allowed to use this kind of language, but astronomers aren't? So it's not a scientific question. I'm not a scientist, but I'm looking at it. Obviously, let's say something like theology, for instance. Somebody on one side says, well, I believe in God because I believe in the designer. I just can't believe that something with hands and teeth and eyes could be just chance. There has to be, as I like to say, the eye, there has to be a great optician in the sky. And another person comes along and says, oh, I'm not so sure about that. What about all the things that go wrong? What about, women in childbirth? If there's a designer, how the hell was it that, the designer didn't do a better job of childbirth? Obviously because the designer was a man, but you know what I mean. Why don't you think there are two designers or three designers or something like that? Now, I see the job of the philosopher. I'm not a theologian, at least not qua philosopher. I might be a Christian, I might not be. But qua philosopher, what I'm doing is trying to look at this sort of overall thing and trying to make sense of why it is that you get these disagreements. Obviously, something like politics would be the case. Now, you notice I very deliberately said I'm not just a philosopher, I'm a historian too. As you can obviously see, I'm a very, very old man. And I came into philosophy in the 1960s. And this was an incredibly exciting time because there were a number of people, most notably Thomas Kuhn, but others, Norwood Russell Hanson and Stephen Toulmin, who were saying, look, you can't just do philosophy of science. If you want to do philosophy of science, you've got to know about science. Well, that's fair enough. I mean, you've got to know about, let's say, contemporary physics, or you've got to know about the Genome Project or something like that. But they were saying, look, an awful lot of philosophical questions are temporal questions, like somebody's got a theory here, somebody's got a theory here. Why did they change their minds? I mean, right through the Middle Ages, everybody believed that the Earth was at the center. Along comes Copernicus, incidentally, Roman cleric, and he says, oh no, it's the sun at the center. And these people were saying, well, now, if we want to understand these kinds of moves from past to present, or from past to past, more recent past, then we've got to go and look at the science itself, we've got to look at the history of the science. Now, people like Kuhn were saying that if you want to understand what's going on, you've simply got to go to the history of science and learn something about it in order to do philosophy. Now, as it happens, I was one of a group of people in the 60s who were saying, look, an awful lot has been done on physics. To us, it really doesn't look like the social sciences, if I'm going to be, make judgmental, are good enough to spend your life working on them. I mean, I'm not saying that that's necessarily true today. I mean, I think, for instance, something like cognitive science is absolutely terrific. So, I'm looking back at the 60s, and here's biology, and nobody has looked at biology. Now, by the 60s, biology is picking up speed. I mean, the double helix is 1953, Watson and Crick. And so this is coming into areas. And evolution was starting to get people becoming very interested in evolution. That 1959 was the 100th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. So there'd be quite a bit of work done. So, I mean, in a way, I kind of lucked in. I mean, you've got a PhD, so you know exactly what it's like when you're looking looking for a PhD topic. You want an area which hasn't been overworked, but which has got some literature, but hopefully not very good.
Can I ask, do some scientists feel that you philosophers of science and historians of science are just getting in the way? Because after all, they are purely objective. They don't have philosophical assumptions they bring to the discipline. They're not influenced by historical force.
Right. And yes. And the Prime Minister of Australia's got each and every one of us our welfare at heart. Yeah, right. I mean, give me a break. I mean, just not true, is it? I mean, the point is that scientists put their pants on one leg at a time, just like the rest of us. Scientists have, families who nag at them. Scientists are, watch the, rugby just like everybody else. I mean, and some scientists even go to church. Others don't. No, I mean, I think that clearly at one level, science is about the real world. Science is an attempt to understand the real world. But at the same time, everything that one does is a matter of interpretation and conceptual thinking. I mean, look, I'm just looking at you, and I just catch gleaming there that you've got that yellow band ring on your fourth finger, for instance, on your left hand. Now, immediately, I'm thinking, okay, here's a guy who's married. I mean, now, notice that, and I notice you nod at that point. I mean, all of that. I mean, I'm not seeing John is married. What I'm seeing is John has got something there which I know symbolizes the fact that John is in fact married. And then, of course, the nod. I mean, the nod could mean anything. I mean, but, I know what the nod means. It means, yes, I am married. And so, as it were, we trickle on. So, on the one hand, if you like, I'm looking and I see shiny yellow over there. Immediately I start interpreting metal, gold, ring. I mean, don't notice I'm not seeing the other side of it. I mean, ring. But more than that, obviously, not just any old ring, but a ring on a particular finger, which is a ring of a particular kind. I mean, if it had got a death's head on it or something like that, I'd be thinking, my God, is this a motorcycle gang I've got into? And so clearly what's going on is a matter of interpretation, no question about that.
Does science therefore have a worldview it brings to the project akin to a faith worldview?
I think that science certainly has a worldview. Let me put it this way. I think that science has certain methodologies, approaches to the world. I mean, on the one hand, clearly the job of science is to try to understand, let us call it the physical world, meaning the mental world and everything like that, the natural world. So I see, I mean, at one level, that's what science is trying to do. So, I mean, I don't know, I want to call that a world view, but that's, let's say, it's the world task or something like that. But I think what I would want to say is that science then adopts a particular kind of methodology, a naturalistic methodology of trying to understand through laws and things of this nature, which are universally scientific. I mean, people sometimes say methodological atheism, and I think that might be a good way to put it. I mean, notice the very key word methodological rather than metaphysical. So at that level, I think, yes, you do. I mean, obviously, then you have certain basic theories like the Big Bang theory or evolutionary theory or things of this nature, which by and large, scientists universally accept. So you could certainly say this is a worldview. Now, does one want to say that this is a worldview akin to a religious view? I suppose the answer is yes and no. I mean, my own personal feeling is that, sure, I mean, at some level, these are worldviews, but I'm not sure I want to see them as parallel worldviews, because that starts to put you already into a conflict issue. Which one are you going to take? I mean, I'm much more comfortable with that kind of worldview, if you like, where basically they're not trying to do the same thing. I mean, I've been very influenced by the neo-orthodox people like Langdon Gilkey, who used to say, that science asks one sort of question, religion asks another sort of question. What did you do yesterday? Well, we went to the park and we had sandwiches and Coke, and then we got caught in a traffic jam. What did you do yesterday? The kids and I fixed a picnic and took my wife to the park to show her how much we loved her on our birthday. Two completely different answers, not clashing at all. Now, are these worldviews? Use that kind of word if you like, but be very careful that you're not thinking of, two worldviews sort of along the Richard Dawkins way of thinking.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I want to talk to you about a particular scientist who does some philosophy of science in his book, and I have heard you say there are few things more simple than Richard Dawkins' God delusion.
Yeah, no, as I said, makes me ashamed to be an atheist, I think was the phrase I used.
What do you mean by that? In what way is it simple or simplistic?
Well, I think it's not simple, it's simplistic. I mean, there's nothing wrong with KISS, keep it simple, stupid. I mean, I'm all in favour of simple. I mean, that's, one of the virtues of science is simplicity. So there's nothing wrong with simple. There's a great deal wrong with simplistic, in that sense. The trouble with Dawkins, maybe this is envy. The guy sold 3 million copies of the book. I wish I'd sold 3 million copies of one of my books. The trouble is, he just doesn't take the things that he's talking about seriously. Now, I defer to nobody in my admiration for Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, which he published 30 years ago, about the nature of genetics. Now, I don't care whether you agree with the book or not, but it seems to me that that is a serious attempt to understand aspects of the nature of biology. Now, if somebody comes along, and a woman called Mary Midgley did just this, and comes in and says, oh, well, that must be stupid because genes can't be selfish, I think Dawkins has got every right at this point to say, hang on a minute, I know that. I'm using a metaphor. Look at what I'm trying to do with this metaphor and see. Now, you may disagree with what I'm trying to do, but at least try to understand what's going on. I think Dawkins has a perfectly legitimate case there. Now, I want to say equally that I think the theologian or the religious person or the philosopher, and to a certain extent this is a turf war, I think that they have equal right to turn to Dawkins and say, look, if you're going to criticize this stuff, fair enough, but try to make an effort to understand what the position is. Now, I think a classic case would be Dawkins going after the cosmological argument, the causal argument. The causal argument, everything has a cause, the world is a thing, therefore the world must have a cause, call it God. Okay? Philosophy on 100, undergraduate response, what caused God? We've all done it. We've all been there. And, it's a good question, but, it's not the end of the argument. Dawkins then triumphantly says, there you are, bad argument, let's move on.
Well, he in fact thinks he has found a new argument that disproves God to a high probability.
Right, but the point is, just push with the cosmological argument for a moment. You know, and I know, that Christians, St. Augustine, certainly St. Thomas, spent a hell of a lot of, they knew this. And so what they were trying to do was articulate a notion of God who would be first cause. The whole notion of aseity, God as a necessary being, God a se, God's essence is his existence. Now, if Dawkins wants to say, as David Hume would say, that the whole notion of necessary being doesn't work or something like that, then let's talk about that. Let's argue that. I'm inclined to think it might be right. But at least let's, have the honesty, or the intellectual integrity to look at these things and look at the responses that the Christian philosophers, let's say just the Christian philosophers, have made. You may want to rough them up afterwards, but it's like selfish genes. At least do your homework. Now, the trouble with Dawkins is I think that he doesn't get to that point. Now, sure, I mean, of course, I mean, Dawkins, he's got a sort of a fuselage of things. I mean, that the God of the Old Testament is an ethnic cleanser. And, to be perfectly honest, the God of the Old Testament is a bit of an ethnic cleanser. But, of course, and I know that, let us call it a traditional Christian. What I mean is the Christian of St. Augustine, the Christian of St. Thomas and Luther and Calvin, knows these things right down the line. And of course, what they do is you work with these things. You work with how the whole notion of a God was revealed gradually to the Jews, and obviously does not become, manifest in some full sense, at least until Jesus, if not until St. Paul. I mean, we can argue about the Jesus-Paul issue, but you know exactly what I mean. I mean, the point is, Christians have got some grown-up responses to these sorts of things. And I think that Dawkins does a serious misservice to the cause of non-belief by not being prepared to take seriously the kinds of things that believers believe in. I mean, of course, who honestly thinks, for instance, that it's going to be okay for you, John, to say, oh, well, I'm going to take one of my kids and take them up to, the highest point in Sydney and sacrifice them? I mean, is every Christian in Sydney going to say, oh, John, what a wonderful man you are? Or are they going to say, let's get this guy to a psychiatrist as quickly as we can? So this is the point I want to make, not whether or not Christianity works. I mean, frankly, I'm not sure that it does for me. But whether or not the Christian can at least articulate a reasoned defense, which we can then argue about. And that's basically the beef I have with people like Dawkins.
I'm curious to know how you have broken this mold. You do take Christian philosophy seriously, and I know you're a fan of St. Augustine.
Yeah.
Can you tell us something about the story of how you got into that and why you take it so seriously?
Broken the mold. And listen, John, if you want to see me walking across Sydney Harbour later on in the day, I'm happy to do this. So, it takes a rather I don't want to, claim too many powers for myself, but it does take a rather exceptional person to do this. And I'd also like your audience to know that modesty is my greatest virtue. Yes, a good question, and it answers a hell of a lot about Michael Ruse. I mean, I was born in 1940. My parents were conscientious. My father was a conscientious objector during the war, and that brought them into contact with Quakerism. And after the war, they joined the Quakers. And so I grew up as a Quaker, and in fact, my father got a job as a bursar at a Quaker school in the north of England, and I went to another one. And so until 20, I was completely immersed in Quakerism. For whatever reason, my beliefs sort of faded away at that stage, and they've never returned. A little bit like stamp collecting and loving baked beans. I mean, as a kid, I could not understand how anybody would think that baked beans on toast were not the greatest meal that you could possibly have. About the age of 20, I'm all in favour of baked beans, but I'm not, they're not the only food which is available. And I guess, for whatever reason, the Christianity just went. I mean, I joke that having had one headmaster in this life, I don't need another one in the next. And there's a certain truth to that. I mean, my non-existent God has always been a bit of a Presbyterian who no sooner has he created his earth, his world, than he regrets it bitterly, the Jonathan Edwards kind of God. That's only quasi-humorous. But for whatever reason, it went away. However,
and yet you remained seriously interested in...
Well, I've always been seriously interested. I mean, as Thomas Henry Huxley said, one could be deeply religious in an absence of theology. And I think that explains me. I always say part of it, at least, that is having grown up as a Quaker, it's very difficult to hate religion or hate Christianity. I mean, my Christianity was the Christianity of very decent, caring human beings.
They're a very friendly mob.
They're very friendly. That's one way to put it. A mob would not quite cover the weighty friends of my childhood, but I know what you mean. I mean, they are a very friendly, but a very deeply concerned, I think, in a good way, group of people, whether it's with the children in their community or in their jobs or in outreach to things like world peace and issues like that. So as I say, although I've, the beliefs have gone, I've always felt very empathetic to Christianity. Now, of course, in North America, a lot of Quakers, I don't think, have a much more belief than Unitarians. When I grew up as a child in England, we Quakers were deeply Christological. I mean, Quakers, you probably know, do not spend a lot of time reading the Bible. That for them, it's the inner light. So we were not Bible, sola scriptura types. But nevertheless, that we were deeply, deeply Christological. I mean, there's no question that Jesus Christ for us was the Son of God. And I've always felt that if these beliefs go, then at some level, I don't really have the right to participate. And I don't want to. I mean, if I'd married a fellow Quaker, I could well imagine I might still be doing it. But and I've got good friends who are Anglicans who say, well, I don't know about God, but gosh, I love the music. And I could see that. I mean, I respect that. But for me, it went. Now, what happened in my case was, to sort of switch back to where we were before, in the 1960s, I start doing philosophy of science. I start doing philosophy of biology. This is the time when, as I say, people like Thomas Kuhn were saying, look at the science, look at its history. So with biology, of course, I naturally turned to looking at Darwin and that sort of thing. And I'd always loved Victorian Britain. I loved Dickens. I love Anthony Trollope and that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know why I don't like Middlemarch. I mean, this, strike me dead. I'm not George Eliot.
It's on my bedside at the moment.
Yeah, but, oh boy, I love David Copperfield. And I love Barchester Towers. But anyhow, so of course I got very much immersed in writing about the history of science. In fact, I wrote a book and published a book called The Darwinian Revolution in 1979. Well, the late 70s was just the time when in America, and don't forget, I was in Canada by this time, the late 70s were just the time when the creationist movement was really started to heat up. And people like Duane Gish and Henry Morris were debating and that sort of thing. And I got involved, and surprise, surprise, I discovered that I not only quite liked doing this sort of thing, but I was quite good at it. I mean, what you need to debate with somebody like Gish is not a brilliant scientist. You need somebody like me who realizes a good joke could be worth twice, a couple of good arguments in front of an audience. So, cutting a long story short, in 1981, the creationists managed to get a law enacted in Arkansas, the southern state, insisting that the kids in the classrooms get balanced treatment. In other words, they were going to get both evolution and creation. Now, this is against the Constitution, or so the American Civil Liberties Union argued, and so they brought suit. And so I was one of a number of people, including the late Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, who was brought in as a witness for the ACLU, as an expert witness. And in fact, we did win a smashing victory. But more importantly for me, this then started to bring me into contact with a number of liberal Christians, people at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, for instance, Philip Hefner. And I gather that you've interviewed Keith Ward, the former Regius Professor of Theology at Oxford, an Anglican priest. And this brought me into contact with people like Keith Ward and Arthur Peacock. And I found myself feeling very comfortable with these people. I mean, although I'd grown up as a Quaker, and these were, other denominations, that didn't really matter. I felt very much that at some level we were fellow travelers, and that whether I believed or not, whether they believed or not, was not quite as important as the fact that we felt on the one hand, that the parable of the talents is the most important of Jesus' stories, that we're not put on this earth just to enjoy ourselves. We're not put on this earth to have a good time, but that particularly those of us who've been privileged either with, if I could say it, intelligence or whatever, and of course, good secure backgrounds with good educations, then we've got an obligation to use these things. So on the one hand, I felt very, very comfortable with these people on that side. And as I say, on the other hand, I like to say I'm very religious in an absence of theology. So I was particularly concerned and comfortable working, as it were, almost alongside these people to try to articulate, my visions of the world and these sorts of things. At that point, it was very much trying to articulate some sort of position which would be important, particularly in America, although I was still living in Canada at the time, but where one could articulate some position which wouldn't, as it were, tip you into that extreme evangelical literalism, but that one could find some sort of middle ground. Now, of course,
I'd really like to move on to evolutionary theory, Darwin, and so on. Can you, for a non-scientific audience, just give us a very brief summary of Darwinian evolution?
Right. Well, I think you've got to separate out a number of factors here. On the one hand, you've got the notion of evolution. Evolution, I take it, is the belief that organisms develop gradually from, as Darwin said, one or a few forms, probably perhaps from inorganic materials, by natural law. In other words, without miracles, that this was once it got going, it all sort of, develops, and finally you get up to humans and not just humans, but gorillas and fruit flies and the AIDS virus and all of these things. So that's the one thing. Now this, of course, is Darwin wasn't the first evolutionist, but I think in The Origin of Species in 1859, he was the first to make this, let's call it commonsensical. So that's the first thing. Then secondly, of course, you've got the actual paths of evolution. Did, for instance, the big one, are the birds descended from just regular reptiles, or are the birds descended from those reptiles known as dinosaurs? Big discussion, these days I think most paleontologists would say they came from the dinosaurs. So this would be paths. How does evolution go? And also, for instance, human evolution. The two big things about humans is we're up on our back legs and we got big brains. Which came first, the brains or the? Well, thanks to Lucy, we now know we got upright, and then the brains got bigger and bigger and bigger. So that would be paths. Darwin didn't do a huge amount. Darwin, he was interested in this, but this was not where Darwin did a lot of work. Then, of course, you've got the whole question of the mechanism. In other words, what makes it work? Just like what makes the world work? Well, Newton's gravitational attraction. What makes biology work? Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. More organisms are born than can survive and reproduce. There's a potential population explosion. There's going to be what Darwin, or rather what Thomas Malthus called, a struggle for existence, more particularly a struggle for reproduction. So only some are going to get through and some won't. Those that get through will, on average, get through because they've got features that the others don't have. They may be faster or able to, do drought better or be better protected against the predators or something like that. And so you get what Darwin calls a natural form of the breeder's selection. And this is a kind of different, to use a modern phrase, this is differential reproduction. And given enough time, this is going to lead to change. But it's very important for Darwin. It's not just any kind of change. It's change in the direction of adaptation. Eyes, teeth, nose. And why is this important for Darwin? Because he had been at the University of Cambridge training to be a clergyman. He had read William Paley's Natural Theology, and Paley is the big man from the argument from design. Organisms are not thrown together randomly. They work, they function. Why? Because of the great designer in the sky. Darwin bought into this completely. The design-like nature of organisms is the the differentiating mark of the Darwinian. Now, whether or not you believe that there was a real design, and I think Darwin did for a lot of his life, clearly Richard Dawkins doesn't. He talks about the blind watchmaker. But Richard Dawkins agrees that the world is as if designed. And so this is what Darwinian evolution sets out to do. And the critics, people like Stephen Jay Gould, are going to be people who say, I'm not so sure that the world is as design-like. Not whether the world is designed, but whether the world is as design-like as Darwin and his followers say. I mean, to give an example, we've both got hair, but, let's suppose you were as bald as a coot. Yeah, maybe I'll give you a year or two. Maybe, if I come back next time, maybe, you'll fit. Now, okay, you're bald. Do I say this is an adaptation that, in fact, it makes you, sexy? I mean, don't forget Darwin's more about sex than even Freud. I mean, does this make you a super stud? And all the girls of Sydney say, oh, my hero, I want to have babies with this man because he's bald. Or is this just a kind of byproduct, just, I don't know, byproduct to testosterone, just something that happens? A Darwinian tends to look for purpose. Yes, there must be a reason. The Gouldian tends to say, I don't think the world's that well designed. I mean, when I use the word designed, I don't mean designed with a capital D.
The appearance of.
Yeah, right. And
it's in this sense that I've heard you say that Darwinism is really the bastard child of Christianity.
Yes, I would say that. I think I would truly say that. It's what a bastard children. I mean, they don't look like their parents, and then suddenly you catch that vision of them and you say, oh my God. Happened to me. I was on a program called Firing Line, and I watched the television afterwards, and this chap got up and walked up to the podium, which was me, and I said, oh my God, it's my father. And that's how I feel about Darwinism. I mean, a lot of the time, sure, it's got nothing to do with Christianity, and then suddenly, oh my God, it's, oh my God, it is Christianity. The point about Darwinism is, yes, it is. I mean, look at it. I mean, what is Christianity? It's a story of origins. It's a story about humans. It's a story about our special place in the universe. And for many of us, it's a story about, well, what should we do? For a lot of Darwinians, it's a story about origins. It's a story about humans. We've been talking for half an hour. I've been talking about humans for 25 minutes of that. It's a story, about who we are, what we should do. And of course, these days, Darwinians are very much into discussing things like morality and that sort of thing. So, to circle back to your first question about, rival world pictures, at some level, there's no question that it can be taken that way. And obviously, for somebody like Dawkins, completely and utterly. But the point I want to make is the point that you pick up on, is that these are not two independent stories. These are very much, Darwinism, at least in that sense, is very much a story which comes into being in the light of Christianity. I mean, the ancient Greeks were not evolutionists. Why weren't, Empedocles perhaps, but why weren't they evolutionists? And the answer is because evolution would be an answer to a question they were not asking. The ancient Greeks thought of the world as eternal. So origins, in that sense, is not an issue for ancient Greeks because the world is eternal. Christianity, or Judeo-Christianity, evolution are both answers to where did we come from, sort of thing. How did it all begin? Where did it start? So at that level, even more deeply than the overlaps, let's say, about design, I would want to say that evolutionary theory just generally is at some level a deeply Judeo-Christian enterprise. I could well imagine going to Andromeda and finding intelligent beings who did not believe in evolution. Now, they wouldn't believe in creationism because, that's the same thing but wrong. I'm not saying they'd all be creationists, but I could well imagine them as it were, not conceptualizing the world. And this, of course, brings us back to something else you asked me about earlier, about, do we just see the world as it is? I mean, no, obviously what we do is we bring, as it were, our questions to try to solve the problems of the world, but the solutions we come up with are very much responses to the questions which we ask, which sometimes are purely practical. How do I cure this disease? But other times are much more conceptual, like, what is the origin of everything?
This ties into what I understand a number of historians of science argue, that really science was given its impetus because of the Christian view of the world, the idea of origins and design.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of these things, and not all historians would agree with that. But
what's your view?
But I buy this one in a big way. I see the scientific revolution. I think the fact that the scientific revolution comes at the same time as the Reformation is not necessarily pure chance. But certainly,
this has been argued by Peter Harrison in some detail, hasn't it?
Right, absolutely. And I mean, I just think that this is the case. And certainly, when I come to Darwinism, there's no question that both the scientific theory, but also more of the world picture that some people want to make of it, I think is intimately connected both with the Christian story, but also, of course, with the way that by the 19th century, and I hardly have to tell somebody like you, people were wrestling with Christianity and what, the death of God sort of issues. And I think often much less to do with science and much more to do with things like higher criticism, trying to understand the nature of the Bible, and theological issues. I mean, people have looked at this. Hardly anybody in the 19th century became an agnostic. Very few became atheists, but hardly anybody became an agnostic because of science. Almost everybody, starting with Darwin, became agnostics because they were troubled with aspects of the Christianity they'd grown up with. I mean, Darwin, for instance, could not accept that his father, whom he thought was the greatest man he'd ever met, who was a non-believer, would be condemned to everlasting suffering because of his non-belief. And Darwin said, if that's what Christianity is, I don't want any part of it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I see an awful lot of this is both coming out of Christianity, but also trying to define its, maybe this goes back to the bastard offspring, trying to define itself against Christianity, which of course is precisely what, children do and what children should do. Really and truly, you don't want your kids to be carbon copies of you. You want kids to be, at least at some level saying, I love you dearly, Dad, but by God, if ever I turn out like you, we both failed. And you know exactly what I mean. And I see, in certain respects, Darwinism doing this. Now, I would want to say myself that if you want to be a Christian, then I think at one level, I think your religious beliefs must evolve, not just necessarily you personally, but over the years. I mean, Langdon Gilkey used to say, when people criticized him, he said, do you still have departments of bleeding? No, we gave those up 200 years ago. Then why should you think that theology is going to stand still as well? So I would want to say that in a way, and of course there's been a long tradition among Christians, starting with Frederick Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury, saying Darwinism is a challenge to the Christian, not necessarily a refutation, but something that the Christian must take in and somehow use to try to come to a more articulated faith. I admire, although I don't necessarily agree with them, people like Jack Hort, the Catholic theologian in America who wants to write books like Better Than Darwin, who wants to take Darwinism into his Catholic Christianity and somehow use this to, as it were, articulate what is for him a clearer and more comprehensive notion of what it is to be a practicing Christian in this day and age.
There are a number of highly qualified evolutionary biologists who are committed Christians.
Well, they certainly have been. Ronald Fisher was one, for instance. Theodosia Dubchansky was another. Of course,
but even today, Francis Collins,
well,
Simon Conway Morris.
Francis Collins, I don't think of immediately as an evolution. I mean, he is an evolutionist, but I mean, of course, he's the genome man. But Francis Collins, of course, is absolutely and completely, a case in point of somebody who is a deeply committed Christian, and at the same time, a deeply committed scientist. And thirdly, a thoroughly nice human being with a good sense of humor about the whole thing. And I have to say this. One of the problems I have with the so-called new atheists, the Richard Dawkinses of the world, is that they're a little bit like the Calvinist preachers. There's a little bit of the humorless fanaticism about these people. I mean, the God Delusion is not what I'd call a fun read. You know what I mean? It does not come across as a book by a human being who is a happy human being. Nor does, let me say, something like Evolution, the Fossils Say No by Duane Gish, although I know Gish, and in fact, I rather like Gish. But these, both sides, rather come across as people who are fairly stressed out. Now, I don't mean the only way you can be a good Christian is to be a happy camper. But, this goes back to my childhood. Every now and then, meeting would be devoted to rather gloomy, weighty friends getting up and talking about how God has a sense of humor. I like to joke that God does have a sense of humor because Philip Johnson, the well-known intelligent design chap, was born on June the 19th, 1940. And then God said, right, 2 days later, Michael Ruse is going to be born June the 21st. I think that proves that God has a good sense of humor.